Hello and welcome to one new edition of Spain Writes, America Reads. This is a series that we have of talks with Spanish authors that have been translated into English and published in the States. I'm really happy today to have with us Manuel Vilas, one of our best authors and a good friend, and with a novel, a book that I think is a book that has had a more deeper impact in Spanish literature in the last 10 years. And I'm seriously not exaggerating. It happened to me, and I think it's going to happen to the America readers too. So we have with us Manuel, and we have also his translator, Andrea Rosenberg, and Alison Fairbrother from Riverhead Books, who published the book in the States. So Alison, you have the floor. I'm very happy that you promote our Spanish authors, and very happy to have you here.
Thank you, Miguel, for that introduction. And thank you to the Cultural Office of the Embassy of Spain for hosting this wonderful event and this wonderful series. As Miguel said, I'm Alison Fairbrother. I'm an editor at Riverhead Books, and we are extremely honored to have published Ordesa by Manuel Vilas, translated by Andrea Rosenberg. I'm going to just briefly introduce each of them and then tell you a little bit about my own experience with this remarkable book, Ordesa. Manuel Vilas is one of Spain's most accomplished poets and writers. He has published 6 novels, 13 books of poetry, and has been widely published in newspapers and literary journals. Andrea Rosenberg is a translator from Spanish and Portuguese. Her translations include novels and graphic narrative by Tomás González, Paco Roca, Inés Pedrosa, and Aurora Shilonen. She holds an MFA in literary translation and a master's in Spanish from the University of Iowa. I first learned about Ordesa a few years ago after hearing that it was the biggest literary book Spain had seen in many years. It was an instant word-of-mouth bestseller, selling 20,000 copies in just 2 weeks in Spain. In Italy, the Italian edition, they've had to reprint it 7 times, and around the country, Manuel has commanded audiences of thousands. In France, it won the nation's most important literary prize, Le Prix Féminin Étranger, and in Portugal, it was recommended by the nation's president. Critics have said that Ordesa is, and I'm quoting, magnificent, brave, heartbreaking, breathtaking, irresistible, extreme, unforgettable, and full of wonder. And Riverhead published it here last week in the US to rave reviews. This is our beautiful edition here, including a review in the New York Times which called it glorious, and a meditation on yearning, solitude, and self, a soul storm, a mirage of phantom figures, resurrected images of dead ancestors, childhood memories, the changing face of Spain itself. In addition, the New York Times particularly credited Andrea's translation as sparkling. So I am so pleased to be here today with Manuel and his translator, Andrea. To start us off, I wanted to ask Manuel, where did the idea for Odessa come from? And how did you come to write this book? Do you see it, as many critics have written, as an autobiographical novel?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for your question. Hablaré en español. La novela es autobiográfica, completamente autobiográfica. Empecé a escribirla después de la muerte de mi madre, en el mes de mayo de 2014. Con la muerte de mi madre se extinguía la memoria de mi familia. Mi padre había muerto ya. Y viví una época de mucho sufrimiento, porque además me estaba divorciando. Con lo cual estaba diciendo adiós a 2 familias, la familia en donde yo había sido hijo y la familia en la que yo había sido padre, la familia que yo había construido, de modo que me enfrentaba a una soledad gigantesca. Y fruto de esa soledad nació Ordesa.
Okay, so Manuel has said that the novel is completely autobiographical. He began to write it after the death of his mother in May of 2014. He felt in that moment that the memory of his family was being extinguished because his father was already dead. And so it was a moment of great pain for him, especially because at the same time that this profound death happened, he was also in the middle of a divorce. So it was like saying goodbye to two families at once, one in which he had been a son, and the other in which he had constructed himself, in which he had been a father. And so it led to a period of what he called enormous loneliness.
Manuel, one of my favorite comments about Ordesa is from a reader who wrote that the novel breaks as much as it heals. And from the moment I first read it, I felt the same way. It's emotionally nourishing, I think, in a way that very few books are. We're so deep in the narrator's head that I think we feel his pain as if it's our own. And Andrea and I actually talked about how we're moved to tears every time we read this book, even though we've read it now countless times, you know, in the translation and editing process, which is a true testament to the power of the novel. The tone that you capture is very intimate. It's highly emotive, but I find it profoundly readable and hypnotic. You know, it's hard to leave this narrator's head. It's hard to put the book down. So I wanted to ask you how you achieved this balance between deep emotionality and readability.
La novela tiene una exploración en el dolor, que es la parte que más fuerte emocionalmente, pero yo me di cuenta de que todo en la vida, en todas las partes de la vida hay belleza. Esa es la originalidad de la novela. Que pese al dolor y pese al sufrimiento, el narrador descubre la profundidad de la vida. Y entonces se transforma el dolor en belleza. Si hay una originalidad en la novela, es esa mezcla de sufrimiento y belleza.
So the novel explores pain, which has enormous emotional power. But Manuel has realized that every element, every part of life also contains beauty at the same time. And that despite pain and suffering, the narrator discovers beauty throughout the novel. And that if there's anything original in the book, it is that juxtaposition of pain and beauty.
That's beautiful, thank you. I wanted to invite Manuel and Andrea to read a selection from the text, if you would. First, Manuel in Spanish and then Andrea in English.
Ya. Voy a leer, I'm going to read the beginning of the Ordesa in Spanish. Ojalá pudiera medirse el dolor humano con números claros y no con palabras inciertas. Ojalá hubiera una forma de saber cuánto hemos sufrido y que el dolor tuviera materia y medición. Todo hombre acaba un día u otro enfrentándose a la ingravidez de su paso por el mundo. Hay seres humanos que pueden soportarlo. Yo nunca lo soportaré, nunca lo soporté. Miraba la ciudad de Madrid y la irrealidad de sus calles y de sus casas y de sus seres humanos me llagaba por todo mi cuerpo. He sido un excehomo, no entendí la vida. Las conversaciones con otros seres humanos se volvieron aburridas, lentas, dañinas. Me dolía hablar con los demás. Veía la inutilidad de todas las conversaciones humanas que han sido y serán. Veía el olvido de las conversaciones cuando éstas aún estaban presentes. La caída antes de la caída. La vanidad de las conversaciones, la vanidad del que habla, la vanidad del que contesta, las vanidades pactadas para que el mundo pueda existir. Fue entonces cuando volví otra vez a pensar en mi padre, porque pensé que las conversaciones que había tenido con mi padre eran lo único que merecía la pena. Regresé a esas conversaciones a la espera de lograr un momento de descanso en mitad del desvanecimiento general de todas las cosas. Creí que mi cerebro estaba fosilizado. No era capaz de resolver operaciones cerebrales sencillas. Sumaba las matrículas de los coches y esas operaciones matemáticas me sumían en una honda tristeza. Cometía errores a la hora de hablar el español. Tardaba en articular una frase. Me quedaba en silencio y mi interlocutor me miraba con pena o desdén. Y era él quien acababa mi frase. Tartamudeaba y repetía 1000 veces la misma oración. Tal vez había belleza en esa disfemia emocional. Le pedí cuentas a mi padre. Pensaba todo el rato en la vida de mi padre. Intentaba encontrar en su vida una explicación de la mía. Me volví un ser aterrorizado y visionario. Me miraba en el espejo y veía no mi envejecimiento, sino el envejecimiento de otro ser que ya había estado en este mundo. Veía el envejecimiento de mi padre. Podía así recordarle perfectamente. Solo tenía que mirarme yo en el espejo y aparecía él, como en una liturgia desconocida, como en una ceremonia chamánica, como en un orden teológico invertido. Andrea, tu propia creación.
If only human pain could be measured with precise numbers, not vague words. If only there were some way to assess how much we've suffered, to confirm that pain has mass and measure. Sooner or later, every man must confront the insubstantiality of his own passage through this world. Some human beings can stomach that. Not me, not ever. I used to look at the city of Madrid, and the unreality of its streets and houses and humans felt like nails through my flesh. I've been a man of sorrows. I've failed to understand life. Conversations with other humans seemed dull, slow, destructive. It pained me to talk to others. I could see the pointlessness of every human conversation that has been and will be. Even as they were happening, I knew they'd be forgotten. The fall before the fall. The futility of conversations, the futility of the speaker, the futility of the spoken to. Futilities we've agreed to so the world can exist. At that point, I'd start thinking about my father again. The conversations I used to have with him seemed like the only thing that was worth a damn. I'd go back to those conversations, hoping for respite from the universal deterioration of things. It felt like my brain was fossilized. I couldn't perform simple mental operations. I would add up cars' license plate numbers, and the activity plunged me into a deep sadness. I stumbled over my words. It took me a long time to get a sentence out. When I went silent, the person I was talking to would look at me with pity or scorn and end up finishing it for me. I used to stammer, repeating the same thing over and over. Maybe there was beauty in my stuttering emotions. I called my father to account. I was constantly thinking about my father's life, seeking an explanation for my own life in his. I became racked by fear and delusions. When I looked in the mirror, I saw not my own self growing old, but someone else who'd already been here in this world. I saw my father growing old. It made it easy to remember him in meticulous detail. All I had to do was look in the mirror and he'd appear, like in some unfamiliar liturgy, a shamanic ceremony, an inverted theological order.
Hay una cuestión muy importante. el gran trabajo de la traductora Andrea, porque yo siento que en la traducción se crea un nuevo libro, un libro escrito a cuatro manos, en donde el traductor tiene una responsabilidad del mismo tamaño que el escritor en su lengua original. De modo que solo puedo estar inmensamente agradecido a tu trabajo, Andrea.
Gracias. Manuel has said that there's one very important issue, which is the work of the translator, that he feels that a translation creates a new book, one written by four hands in collaboration, and that the translator has as much responsibility in that book as the writer did in the original.
It was a remarkable experience to hear that chapter read back to back by the two of you. Thank you so much. Andrea, I wanted to ask you, what drew you to Manuel's work? What were your first impressions of the novel when you read it? And what excited you about it and what challenged you as a reader?
Well, as for most translators, probably challenge and excitement are the same thing. So they often coincide. I was really struck.
She's so struck that she stopped speaking. We hope to get her back. But I think what she did was the best thing for a translator was to translate what she just did, no? As an author, breaking the work of a translator, which I think it's something that we have to do as the cultural office, because the translators are the one who bring into the American readers our authors, no? And as Manuel said, they're very, very important. So I think she's back.
Sí.
You don't have. We don't hear you.
Andrea, the phone.
Am I there?
Andrea, I think you're back.
Okay, great. Sorry, so what did everybody miss?
You say that you were struck and then you remain paralyzed. So
oh, no.
You can take it from there.
Dear me. Okay, so I was saying I was struck by the simplicity of the prose, and yet its ability, nevertheless, to evoke really powerful emotion. I'm accustomed to really high-flung poetry and exaggerated lyricism, and having that be really linked with emotion, and yet Manuel's text doesn't use a lot of those rhetorical techniques. Instead, it by evoking these sort of universal experiences, it manages to tap the same emotional wells.
And what was your translation process like? What were some of the fundamental choices you had to make? And what were the hardest or the most exciting elements to translate?
So my translation process is generally always the same for each book, because I don't read the books in advance. I usually don't have time. So I just translate from the beginning. Gregory Rabasa, a very prominent translator of Spanish, once wrote that he translated that way. So I give myself permission. And he uses the excuse that it gives the translator the same experience of surprise that a reader would get, and that is captured somehow mysteriously in the translation. So yeah, I just start from the beginning and start working my way through the book. I usually read, a few pages ahead at a time, but I don't know the ending until I get there. And as far as, the things that were hardest about this book, I would say there are the things that are always hard about Spanish, in particular. And then there are the things about this book. And one of those is that I wanted to try really hard to make sure that the book was not flat. Spanish relies a lot on nouns, and English is much more wedded to verbs. And I think in this novel in particular, which is all about memories and these snapshots, which is reinforced by the photographs in the book, you have these it's almost like an imagist poem, you know, where you have these isolated images, and so there is a lot of stillness in the book, and that works really well with a writing tradition and a writing style that is using nouns a lot. But I wanted to make sure that in English, because we don't write that way, that the text didn't get really flattened out and dry, that the liveliness of the voice was captured too, the sort of self-deprecating humor and irony that's throughout the book, that all of that was there too.
Thank you. Speaking of the self-deprecating humor and irony, Manuel, the subject matter obviously can be quite dark. You know, it's about grief and loss and the diminishing of connections. But I agree with Andrea completely that there are these flashes of brilliant humor and levity in the text, such as when you name characters after classical musicians. How did you arrive at this idea to sort of alternate the darkness and the light?
No. El humor creo que tiene que ver con mi forma de ver la vida. Incluso cuando estaba metido en el dolor del duelo por mi madre, aparecía el humor. Tiene que ver, yo pienso que tiene que ver con la literatura española, con Cervantes. Es como si un escritor español no pudiera sustraerse a ese humor característico de la literatura española. La idea de los músicos, la idea de nombrar a mi familia con nombres ilustres de la historia de la música, fue una invención de carácter poético. Yo no me atrevía a nombrar con el nombre real que tuvo mi padre y mi madre, y tampoco tenía sentido que me inventara los nombres porque era una narración autobiográfica. En una narración autobiográfica tú no puedes inventarte el nombre de tu padre o de tu madre, pero usar los nombres reales me producía una sensación de pudor difícil. Y no sé de qué manera se me ocurrió nombrarlos con los músicos de la historia, de los famosos músicos, en función del carácter de cada personaje. Mi madre era una mujer dramática. Yo soy melómano, yo escucho mucha música. Mi madre era dramática y cada vez que pensaba en mi madre, ¿a qué suena el espíritu de mi madre? Sonaba a Richard Wagner. ¿A qué suena el espíritu de mi padre? A Johann Sebastian Bach. Y así fui viendo un orden, una forma de describir toda mi familia como si fuesen música. También sociológicamente era emocionante, porque una familia humilde, de clase media-baja española, de repente quedaba convertida en aristocracia. Era como un poco el poder de la literatura, capaz de elevar a personas que vivieron de una forma humilde a ilustres compositores de la música.
Okay, so humor, he thinks it has to do with his way of seeing life. Even when Manuel was in the midst of the deepest grief over his mother's death, humor would appear. He also posits that it may have to do with Spanish literature and the Spanish literary tradition, Cervantes, that humor is a characteristic, like fundamentally, of Spanish literature, and that a Spanish writer cannot escape that tradition. The particular decision of naming characters in the novel after important figures in music history, he says it was poetic in nature. He didn't want to use the real names that felt like intrusive, but using invented names felt ridiculous. And so he's not quite sure how the idea occurred to him, but he came up with this, this device of naming the characters after figures, these important composers, and names that match the personalities. He listens to a lot of music, and so he would ask the fundamental question, what does this person's soul sound like? And so his mother was very dramatic as a person, and so he associated her with Richard Wagner, and the father with Bach. And so one by one with each character in his family, he created this new way of seeing the family. He also found it exciting because it transformed a family with a very humble beginnings that had its origins in the peasantry into something associated with the aristocracy. And all of a sudden there were these very illustrious figures.
That's fascinating. And it works so well, it occurs to me also with the recurring themes in the novel about class and wealth and capitalism as well. Andrea, I wanted to ask you about your process in terms of how you thought about translating the juxtaposition between the darker and the more sort of profound moments of the text with the lightness and the colloquialism. How did you achieve that effect in English?
Yeah, Spanish as a Latinate language, it has a lot of words in it that are cognates with English, but that we tend to use in a much more formal way. We often have both, right? We'll have liberty and we have freedom, but they have like a different vibe to them, one from the Latin and one from the Germanic roots. And so one of my quests always in translating is to resist the cognate, unless it makes sense to use it, and especially with this novel, in trying really hard not to make it ponderous. I really wanted to make sure that I was using words that a person using to himself in his home, in his apartment, as he looks at the grease on the frying pan in the kitchen, that he would use in his mind rather than the very formal words. And I think that sort of helps the humor come through also, that you're using, because humor is not a formal thing, right? We do have wonderful forms of sort of straight-laced, deadpan humor that have a formal tone, but in general, it comes from this more raucous place. And so I think like trying to balance that vocabulary was a really important element.
Thank you. Manuel, I wanted to ask you about the themes of Spanish history and religion and monarchy in Ordesa. The narrator can at times be critical of the monarchy and critical of religion, yet I think there's a very glorious sort of spirituality infused throughout the book, in which these sort of mundane everyday objects become sublime through memories and photos and recollections. And I'm curious to hear a little bit about your thoughts about the sacred and the profane in the novel, how spirituality shows up.
Sí, yo creo que vivimos ya en un mundo literariamente globalizado. Lo que un escritor occidental observe en España vale para Francia, en aspectos sociológicos, vale para Francia, para Estados Unidos, para Alemania, aspectos socioeconómicos relacionados con el capitalismo y relacionados con nuestra forma de vida. Mi manera de trabajar es siempre ambigua. Yo cuando hago en mi novela hago una foto social, histórico-social, por ejemplo en España la monarquía, hay un capítulo dedicado a la monarquía, trabajo la ambigüedad. Eso es también una enseñanza cervantina. ¿Qué es la ambigüedad? La ambigüedad es que un escritor te ofrece una foto literaria de un momento sociohistórico importante, pero no la interpreta, no te dice si eso está bien o eso está mal. Hay una deliberada ambigüedad que yo la aprendí en El Quijote de Cervantes. Es el lector el que con su inteligencia decide qué quiere decir esa foto. Entonces, el escritor hace fotos sobre la realidad sociohistórica que está viviendo y se las ofrece al lector. Son fotos inteligentes y expresivas, pero es el lector el que tiene que decidir el punto de vista, y eso afecta al capitalismo, a la política, a la religión, a la cultura, porque el escritor se niega a juzgar el mundo, no quiere juzgar el mundo. Quiere comprenderlo. La tarea de la literatura, desde mi punto de vista, es la comprensión de la realidad, no su enjuiciamiento, porque juzgar ya hay otros, la sociedad le gusta juzgar mucho, pero el terreno de la literatura es más complejo moralmente. Entonces yo valoro mucho que un escritor no escriba novelas de tesis. Por ejemplo, el capitalismo, que el capitalismo es malo, ¿no? Eso ya es, eso no tiene enjundia, no tiene fuerza literaria. El escritor debe profundizar más, ¿no? Y así en todos los temas, la religión, el amor, etcétera, etcétera, ¿no? Es comprensión y no enjuiciamiento lo que yo busco. Perdón, Andrea, que me he alargado.
Oh no, I do think that I might have missed the very last part, but you can add on at the end. So Manuel says that we live in a world that in literary terms is globalized, and that what a Western writer observes in Spain also applies in Germany, France, the United States. That his way of working is always ambiguous, and he connects this ambiguity also to Cervantes. You can see the influence of Cervantes in Spanish literature. Ambiguity, what it consists of is the writer offering a photograph of a socio-historical moment, but not interpreting that photograph, not judging it either good or bad. Instead, the reader is left to assess what that photograph means. Manuel says that these photographs should be intelligent and expressive, and that this applies to capitalism, politics, culture, all of these elements of society. So the writer is not attempting to judge the world, but to understand it. And the world he sees the world as a morally complex place, so appreciates it when writers don't attempt to impose a particular point of view. Not having a novel not have a single unified thesis, a grand unified theory of how the world works, but instead leaving it up to the reader. And what did I miss? ¿Me perdí algo?
No, no.
Okay.
Esta es un tema importante en la novela. It's very important porque es una forma, en mi opinión, es una forma de respetar al lector.
It's a way of respecting the reader. also withholding judgment on the writer's part.
Such an interesting idea. Thank you. Andrea, I wanted to ask you what it was like to sort of translate those particular elements of Spanish culture and history for American readers. How did you approach those translations, and how did you make the narrative feel so universal despite the specificity of the culture and the politics?
I mean, I think Manuel helped a lot with that, right? That even though he's writing about these very specific moments, you don't have to know about the particularities of the Spanish economic crisis in the late 2000s and its specific impact on construction in Spain. I mean, it absolutely devastated the construction industry, and that's how our narrator gets his apartment. But you don't have to know those details to sort of glean what's happening from the text, because the themes are so universal. One danger with a translator helping out the reader is that you limit a text by providing sort of an explanation of what's happening. You risk closing out other possibilities. And so I definitely tried to be judicious in inserting explanations, especially because the novel encompasses so many different themes. So I think that there were moments in the text, there were plenty. I lived in Spain a couple of times, but I had never seen the students of San Ildefonso in Madrid, like with the lottery on Christmas Day. There were elements that were completely new to me. And so I did a lot of YouTube research and things like that to figure out sometimes what was happening in the novel. Yeah, so it's a balance of inserting little explanations as unobtrusively as possible occasionally, but also making sure that you aren't explaining to the reader in just the way that Manuel told us he does not want to do, and allowing the reader to sort of understand on their own terms what's happening. And I think with a novel like this, it's not aimed at a sort of lowest common denominator. So I think that most of the people in the US who are going to read translated literature are going to be open to not understanding something, needing to look something up if they have to. So.
Yeah, thanks. Manuel, I wanted to ask you along the lines of what you were talking about the juxtaposition of pain and beauty. You're obviously an accomplished poet. Ordesa has the emotional resonance of poetry. Ask you how your poetry background informed the writing of the novel.
Yeah. Yo soy un amante de la poesía de Walt Whitman. Y creo que ese amor a Walt Whitman puede explicar la parte poética que hay en Ordesa. La poesía que hay en Ordesa es la siguiente. En la vida hay dolor y hay adversidad, pero la belleza y la fuerza de la vida es tan grande que solo cabe amar la vida. Entonces esa es la lección poética que hay detrás de la novela. Es algo muy whitmaniano. Es una celebración de la vida, aun en la desdicha y en la desgracia. Decía Kafka, otro gran escritor que yo adoro, como Whitman, que la alegría es un derecho del ser humano. La alegría, que es sinónimo de la vida, es un derecho del ser humano. Entonces esa es la parte más profunda de la novela de Ordesa. Tiene un significado poético y es la afirmación profunda de la vida.
So Manuel is a great lover of the poetry of Walt Whitman. And that love for Whitman in part explains the poetic content of Ordesa. Life contains pain and adversity, but the beauty that it also contains is so vast and all-encompassing that one's only option is to love life. So it's a celebration of life, which he sees as a very Whitman-esque quality. Kafka, another of Manuel's beloved writers, said that joy is a human right. And so yeah, the fundamental quality of Ordesa is an affirmation of life and the beauty it contains.
And Andrea, what was it like for you to translate Ordesa, a text that is deeply concerned with syntax, with cadence, with rhythm, with all of the things that a poet like Manuel values so highly?
I did read the text aloud sometimes, to try to make sure that I was creating a rhythm, that I was giving, I was creating that quality in the text that has to do with sound as much as it has to do with any other element of writing. I think a lot of prose does that too, but not in such a concentrated or deliberate way. You want your sentence to sound good, but the particular ways that sounds good in poetry are very different. Like where the sound is crafted in this very deliberate way, whereas instead of making sure like you don't have two vowel sounds right next to each other, sorry, I've forgotten what I was saying. Anyway, I really wanted to focus on the images in the novel because they seem so important, and so also capturing that quality and the beauty in those. I keep looking at my notes on Manuel's speech, what he said, and blanking. I'm sorry. You can ask me something else. I've clearly loved this question.
No, not at all. Not at all. I did want to mention that I think we might have time, Miguel, for a few questions, if there are any from our listeners.
Yes.
I believe there's a chat function. So if you wanted to write to us, we could take a few minutes and answer those. The other thing I was thinking that might be nice just to close out is I wonder if there's a favorite section that either of you have from the novel that's, not the beginning, but a different section that you love that we might close with a brief reading. I know this is unplanned, so we don't have to, but it's a thought.
Bueno, sí, voy a leer. Sí, uno muy famoso, que se hizo muy famoso en las redes sociales cuando apareció la novela, era un fragmento constantemente en Twitter y en Facebook, aparecía muchas veces citado. A ver si es el número 23. Cuando se publicó la novela en España, se produjo un hecho muy interesante, que es que los lectores subían fragmentos a Facebook y a Twitter, y el editor español me dijo, como sigan subiendo tantos fragmentos, nadie se va a comprar la novela porque va a estar tuiteada completamente. Voy a leer uno de los fragmentos que se hizo muy famoso en España. ¿Cuántas veces llegaba yo a mi casa cuando tenía 17 años y no me fijaba en la presencia de mi padre. No sabía si mi padre estaba en casa o no. Tenía muchas cosas que hacer, eso pensaba, cosas que no incluían la contemplación silenciosa de mi padre. Y ahora me arrepiento de no haber contemplado más la vida de mi padre. Mirar su vida, eso, simplemente. Mirarle la vida a mi padre. Eso debería haber hecho todos los días, mucho rato. Es el fragmento 23. Andrea.
At 17, I often disregarded my father's presence when I returned home. I had no idea whether my father was home or not. I had a lot to do, or so I thought, things that did not include silently contemplating my father. And now I regret not having contemplated my father's life more. Looking at his life, just that, nothing more. Looking at my father's life. I should have spent a good long while doing that every day.
Perfecto.
Beautiful.
Suena
Thank you
mejor
both.
en inglés.
Oh, I forgot to actually say what Manuel said at the beginning of reading, that section in particular became quite well known online on social media when the novel came out. It appeared on Twitter and Facebook a lot because when the novel was first published, readers would post excerpts of the novel online, and the editor joked that if people kept uploading bits of the novel, that the whole thing would be available on social media.
Thank you.
That's wonderful. Well, it looks like while you were reading, we did get one question from an audience member. So I just wanted to give you both an opportunity to answer it. From Beth Schmerer writes, have Andrea and Manuel developed a friendship? I'm curious about the relationship between author and translator. Do you want to know each other well, or is it better to keep a professional distance so as not to affect the work?
¿Es para mí?
No, es para Andrea, es la relación de los dos. ¿Cómo es la relación entre si habéis hecho?
Bueno, yo debo decir que Andrea nos escribíamos correos y yo creo además que Andrea estaba emocionalmente conectada con la novela, un poco quizá también estaba viviendo algunas cosas que la novela plantea, ¿no?
Yeah, so he says that we did email, and he sees me as having been emotionally connected with the novel and experiencing some of the things that the novel contains. And in fact, I've actually ended up translating in the past couple of years several novels that deal with these issues of memory and legacy and family. And like I did Paco Roca's graphic novel, The House, La Casa, and Jorge Franco, a Colombian novelist. I did El Cielo a Tiros, which we translated as Shooting Down Heaven, and that all deal with like the father and, you know, what this figure represents. So I did feel like this novel fit in perfectly, especially as I approach middle age, or maybe am in middle age. We won't talk about that. Yeah, in general, as a translator, I try not to get too close in touch with my authors just because I want them to trust me. And I'm always afraid that if I ask too many questions, they're going to be like, who is this idiot translating my novel? And so I always tend to go first to other people, other native speakers, to ask them what they think. I mean, it's also helpful to get a reader's perspective on what a particular tricky passage means, because again, if a writer has written it in a very ambiguous way, but you go to the writer and you ask, what does this mean? And then the writer tells you what it means. But if you go to a reader, what they read is the ambiguity, then as a translator, you risk just putting the explanation in and not leaving that ambiguity there. So there is both a sort of, fear of looking like a dumbass in front of my author, and then also, making sure that a sort of multivalent quality of the text is still present, and not just getting the definitive point of view from the author, but also hearing other perspectives.
Yo creo que en la literatura universal actual se está viviendo, están apareciendo muchísimas novelas que tratan el tema de padres, madres, hijos e hijas. Y Ordesa está en esa tradición que está en la literatura. Pienso ahora, por ejemplo, en Philip Roth, en Patrimonio, o en el escritor noruego Karl Ove Knausgård, o en escritores franceses. Hay un momento en la literatura internacional de necesidad de contar la vida de tu padre y de tu madre. Está en todas las literaturas. En ese sentido, quizá mi novela trata el tema de padres, madres e hijos desde un sentimiento poético que no está en otras novelas. Eso creo que es específico de Ordesa.
In contemporary world literature, Manuel says there are a lot of novels being written in the current moment that are about fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters, those relationships. So Ordesa is part of that tradition, which we see in the American writer Philip Roth, the Norwegian Knausgård. And so there's a need, it comes out of a need to describe one's parents. So in that sense, Ordesa deals with that topic, but does it in a poetic way with a particular aesthetic that is different from the other novels that have done the same thing.
Quizá la sorpresa de Ordesa es que el hijo que habla de su padre y de su madre no solo no los juzga, sino que está enamorado de ellos, los adora. Entonces, estábamos acostumbrados a una literatura que juzgaba a los padres, a veces muy duramente. En Ordesa no solo no hay juicio a los padres, sino que hay amor. Casi hay, una vez un crítico dijo que Ordesa creaba una religión personal compuesta de 3 personas, una religión para 3 personas, el padre, la madre y el hijo.
The surprise in Ordesa, the sort of unusual element of it, is that the son not only does not judge his parents, but is in fact in love with them. We're accustomed to novels in which parents are judged, sometimes quite harshly, but not in Ordesa. So one critic actually said that the novel describes the creation of a personal religion consisting of 3 people, the mother, the father, and the son.
Thank you. Manuel, I have another question from our audience. Francis Rogers asks if you are planning to continue with nonfiction or with autobiography, or will you go back to pure fiction?
Ya. La siguiente novela, después de Ordesa, publicada en España, se titula Alegría y continúa el ciclo autobiográfico. Yo espero que Alegría Riverhead la traduzca pronto al inglés de la mano de Andrea, porque es la continuación de Ordesa, porque si Ordesa trataba el tema de los padres, me di cuenta de que yo también me había convertido en padre y tenía que hablar de mis hijos. Y Alegría, que es la siguiente novela después de Ordesa, es una novela autobiográfica y habla de los hijos. Y esta novela salió en España hace un año.
So the novel that came out after Ordesa is called Alegría, or Joy. And it is a novel that sort of continues the cycle of Ordesa. It's part of the same world. So whereas Ordesa is about the parents, Manuel realized that as a father himself, he needed to talk about his children. And so that is what Alegría deals with.
Thank you. And I think we have one more question and time for one more question, so it's perfect. Maisie Lim asks, the black and white photos in Ordesa were a lovely complement to the novel. Can you talk more about the photos and why you chose to include them?
Las fotos son importantísimas. Las fotos familiares, el álbum de las fotos familiares, porque son el comprobante de que tus seres queridos estuvieron vivos alguna vez. La foto es un arte perturbador. El filósofo francés, ahora no recuerdo el nombre, no me acuerdo del nombre, decía que
Michel Foucault.
No, Foucault no, el de los, este otro famoso semiótico, el padre de la semiótica. Ahora no me acuerdo del nombre. Decía que el tema de la fotografía es la muerte. El tema de la fotografía es la muerte. Yo creo que tenía razón, por eso la foto tiene una fuerza tremenda, porque demuestra que esas personas que tu padre y tu madre o tus abuelos, que ya no están vivos, estuvieron vivos una vez, ¿no? Entonces ese poder de la fotografía es el que yo quería trasladar a Ordesa. Es un comprobante de vida, la fotografía.
So photos are extremely important. The family photo album offers confirmation that your loved ones were once alive. A French philosopher said that the subject of photography is death itself. So photos are incredibly powerful because they show that your grandmother, your mother, your father were alive.
No recuerdo el nombre, ay, no me sale.
Roland Barthes.
Roland Barthes es el que dice en un ensayo sobre la fotografía que el tema de la fotografía es la muerte.
So it was Roland Barthes who said that about photography, that it is fundamentally about death.
Great. Thank you both so much. This was such an enlivening conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I'm so proud of this incredible novel. I hope you will all in the audience get yourselves a copy. And Miguel, thank you for hosting this wonderful event.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Manuel. I think that I'm sure, as I said, that the novel is going to have the same impact that in Spain for the readers. So as we're living through these strange times, I think it would be great. It would be a joy to have Manuel to present Joy in person in the next years to come here. So that would mean that this has been a success, and I'm sure that they're going to love that one too. So thanks a lot, all of you, and we'll see you next year. We'll say bye-bye. Spain Writes, America Reads say bye-bye to this terrible year, and we hope that the next one is going to be a better one. We're sure that it's going to be a better one. So thank you all.
Thank you, Miguel. Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Andrea. Ha sido un placer.
Thank you so much.